summer of 1812. One of the greatest armies in history, over 600,000 strong, marched toward victory under the command of the invincible Napoleon. Victory seemed almost like a divine right. Just 6 months later, only a handful of ghosts remained of that same army. So, what happened to turn this journey, which began with triumph, into one of history's most horrific tragedies? Keep watching this video, because this story will shock you. There was a will that held Europe's fate in its hands, Napoleon's will. His Grand Army, with a force varying between 615,000 and 680,000 according to sources, effective soldier count around 449,000, stood at Russia's border. This army was not just soldiers, it included 1,372 cannons pulled by 200,000 horses and a massive convoy carrying a logistical nightmare. The army was a reflection of Europe's conquest, 302,000 French at the forefront, but behind them 190,000 Germans, 90,000 Poles/Lithuanians, and even Italians and Spaniards. This campaign, which Napoleon called the Second Polish War, was meant to motivate the Poles against Russia. The once proud soldiers now resembled ghosts. This is the story not just of an army's collapse, but of a dream, a monument to hubris. It all began on the banks of a river. June 24, 1812. The waters of the Niemen River witnessed the crossing of that massive army that had brought the continent to its knees. While crossing the Niemen, Napoleon sent one last peace offer, but no response came. The army crossed the river with 3 pontoon bridges and advanced to Kaunas. So why was this enormous army there? The answer lay in a single word: economy. It all started with the 1807 treaties of Tilsit. Russia joined Napoleon's continental system, but when its economy collapsed, it resumed trade with England in 1810. Napoleon saw this as betrayal and used Poland as an excuse, calling it the Second Polish War. To bring his greatest enemy, England, to its knees, Napoleon had imposed the continental blockade on all of Europe. Under this system, no European country was to trade with England. However, Russia, whose economy suffered greatly from this blockade, secretly continued trading. For Napoleon, this was not just betrayal, but a rebellion against the order he had established. This army was not the power of a single nation, French, Poles, Italians, Germans. It was a flood of humanity carrying all the colors of a conquered Europe. The roar of thousands of cannons pulled by tens of thousands of horses was locked on a single target: to force Russian Tsar Alexander I to submit. For Napoleon, this would be the pinnacle of his career, the final and brightest seal of his absolute dominance. Yet, a danger they were unaware of lay silently beneath Russia's vast lands. The Russian commander's strategy was as ruthless as it was simple: retreat without fighting, and leave behind only ashes and emptiness. As the Russian army withdrew, they set fire to their own lands, their own villages. Under the orders of Russian commander Barclay de Tolly, soldiers burned their own villages and destroyed supplies. This scorched earth tactic deprived the Grand Army of its most basic need, life itself. The bloodiest example of this ruthless strategy occurred in August at Smolensk. Napoleon hoped to finally catch and destroy the Russian army there. However, in the bloody battle from August 16 to 18, the French suffered 10,000 casualties, but when they entered the city, they found yet another burning, abandoned ruin before them. The Russian army had once again retreated in an orderly fashion. Napoleon had captured the city but had not found the decisive victory he sought. The Grand Army's morale took its first major blow here. This massive army was dependent on weakening and lengthening supply lines as it advanced, and it could not comprehend its enemies destroying their own homeland with such determination. Napoleon considered ending the campaign here but continued. This was his first major mistake. But in Russia, the rules would be written not by Napoleon, but by geography itself. And then, after months of this relentless pursuit, the earth roared. September 7, 1812. About 110 kilometers from Moscow, in the fields of Borodino, the Russian army finally stopped and waited. That day, two massive armies faced each other in the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. Approximately 250,000 soldiers fought for 12 hours in a narrow area. According to witnesses, the cannon fire that day turned into an unending thunder. At Borodino, important commanders like Russian Prince Bagration were killed. Total casualties exceeded 70,000. This was Napoleon's bloodiest day. At the end of the day, the French had forced the Russians to retreat. On paper, this was a victory. But the cost was horrific. Napoleon had lost 30,000 soldiers. The Russians' losses reached 45,000. This was a Pyrrhic victory. Napoleon had captured the battlefield, but he had not broken the spirit of the Russian army. Marshal Kutuzov's army, though heavily wounded, retreated in order. The gates of Moscow were now open, but this bloody victory was merely a whisper of the approaching disaster. A week later, on September 14, Napoleon and his army entered Moscow. When they saw the towers of the Kremlin, they thought victory had finally arrived. But they were met with silence. There was no resistance, nor a delegation to present the city's keys. The real shock began that night. The Russians were setting fire to their own sacred city. In Moscow, Governor Rostophin released prisoners and started the fires. 4/5 of the city burned. The fires that lasted for days turned wooden Moscow into a giant torch, and then into a pile of ashes. Napoleon waited for a full 36 days in the midst of the burning city, within the walls of the Kremlin. He hoped for a peace message from the Tsar. But that message never came. He had captured a capital but had not won the war. On October 18, he had no choice but to retreat. Napoleon had a plan, to retreat south, along a path that had not yet been plundered, filled with fresh resources. This was the army's hope for salvation. However, Marshal Kutuzov had read his plan. On October 24, in the small town of Maloyaroslavets, the Russians blocked the French southern route. After a bloody battle that lasted all day, the French captured the town but were strategically defeated. The southern path was now closed. This was the moment when the retreat was definitively turned into a tragedy. Napoleon was forced to turn his army back onto the hellish path it had come from, onto the ashes and hunger of Smolensk. The army would return, treading upon its own ashes. And then, Russia's most powerful commander took the stage, General Winter. With the onset of November came freezing colds that caught the army unprepared. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Along with winter came defeats at Vyazma and Krasny. Most of the 200,000 horses died, cannons were abandoned. The cold was an invisible enemy, but there were visible ones too. The Russians' famous Cossack cavalry and partisan groups formed from peasants never let the army rest for a moment. They hunted the weakened, the stragglers, creating a constant climate of fear. When hunger, fatigue, cold, and endless attacks combined, the retreat turned into a desperate chaos for survival. The final act of the disaster played out in late November at the Berezina River. The ice on the river had thawed, and 3 different Russian armies were approaching to trap the French. In that moment when hopes were exhausted, Dutch engineers managed to build 2 makeshift bridges in the icy water, under enemy fire. While the combat-capable part of the army crossed, tens of thousands of civilians, women, and children gathered at the bridges. When Russian artillery targeted this defenseless crowd, it became a complete slaughter. From November 26 to 29, 3 Russian armies trapped them. 40,000 casualties were suffered, but Dutch engineers built bridges in the icy water. On November 29, Napoleon gave the order to burn the bridges, abandoning tens of thousands of souls behind to death. Berezina became the grave of the Grand Army. Upon hearing news of a coup in France, Napoleon abandoned his army on December 5, leaving command to Murat. Of the more than 600,000 soldiers who marched to victory in June, fewer than 100,000 crossed the Niemen River back in December. The number capable of fighting had dropped to as low as 20,000. Nearly 500,000 people had vanished in these lands within 6 months. The French side suffered 380,000 to 420,000 dead/captured, the Russian side 120,000 to 150,000 casualties, totaling 1 million deaths including civilians. This disaster shattered Napoleon's myth of invincibility. It was the beginning of the end. This tragic campaign is one of history's most poignant lessons on hubris, logistics, and the power of nature. Historians summarize this campaign with Charles Menard's famous graph, a line thinning like a river representing the army. What do you think was Napoleon's biggest mistake in this great gamble? Underestimating Russia's geography and climate? Miscalculating Tsar Alexander's unyielding will? Or not forcing the southern path at Maloyaroslavets? Or perhaps the biggest mistake was not replenishing the cavalry and artillery? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to not miss such turning points in history.